3, 2, 1, 0. Plus 5 seconds.
Liftoff normal.
Here we have a majestic liftoff of LVM-3M4 rocket carrying India's prestigious Chandrayaan-3 spacecraft.
Every 5 years, when Indians are casting their vote in parliamentary elections, the world watches with admiration as the world's largest democracy charts its future path. Because the outcome of decisions made by 1.3 billion people resonates around the globe.
On 26 May 2014, after winning the historic election, Mr. Narendra Modi took oath as the 14th Prime Minister of India.
मैं नरेंद्र दामोदर दास मोदी
Hi, I'm Mohan Thite. I work as a management professor in Australia. I'm also the founder and principal of the Glass Half Full Media.
Hello, I'm Shweta Shah from the city of Pune, India. I'm a gold medalist with a master's degree in political science and international relations.
Let's embark on a captivating journey through the intricate tapestry of India's evolving global narrative in this compelling and factual political documentary. This meticulously crafted film explores the multifaceted dimensions of India's foreign policy and global image, particularly in the last decade under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. What distinguishes this documentary is its scholarly approach, interweaving insightful interviews with subject matter experts from think tanks, including the Wilson Center USA and the Chatham House UK, universities in the USA, Australia, and Israel, a scientist and a political analyst from Pakistan, and distinguished panel of former Indian diplomats. The objective is to provide a nuanced and critical outside-in perspective. These authoritative voices offer a comprehensive analysis of the political, security, economic, and cultural contours shaping India's global standing. The documentary also scrutinizes the challenges and opportunities for India's global stature and influence. Join us on this enlightening expedition into the heart of India's diplomatic and geopolitical endeavors, witnessing the nation's aspirations and influence reaching new heights.
In this documentary, we won't delve into the inner workings of the Modi government's domestic policies. Instead, our focus lies exclusively on India's foreign affairs and the global perception of India during Mr. Modi's two-term tenure. In this introductory episode, we look at the following specific aspects. First, India's ability to maintain strategic autonomy in handling geopolitical tensions and challenges. Second, whether and how China's rapid rise and conduct as a superpower threatens to upset the political and economic stability around the world. Third, how well India is performing in its neighborhood first policy in South Asia and beyond. And fourth, how far India has come to realize its quest to become a Vishwa Mitra, a friend of the world. Before we look at the present and the future of India's global makeover, it's important to look at the past and review its international relations during the tenure of the previous UPA government, led by Dr. Manmohan Singh from 2004 to 2014.
It is amazing that before 2014, Indian leaders had not paid bilateral visits to the immediate neighbors like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, literally for a matter of 20 and 30 years. And he rectified this.
Well, some successes like the India-US nuclear deal, but big failure vis-a-vis Pakistan, unable to have a coherent policy towards Pakistan. Restarted the dialogue with Pakistan even after the Mumbai 2008 attacks. And of course, was unable also to handle the China relationship, made too many accommodative gestures, which have not helped.
There were some achievements, there were a number of misses also. And if I could just give examples, I think the biggest achievement of the UPA 1 and 2 put together was the India-US nuclear deal. And I think the last 4 or 5 years of the UPA 2 government, there was, what is known as a policy paralysis. And there were a large number of scams and corruption scandals that were happening. So there was not really much meaningful work either in the area of domestic policies or in the area of foreign policy.
So that was the beginning of India's sort of realignment of India's foreign policy, developing closer ties with countries in East Asia, but also developing closer ties with the United States.
Well, the UPA government's sole achievement was the US-India nuclear deal, but it was nullified by the passage of the nuclear liability law. The UPA government also failed to address Chinese border incursions and permitted the influx of cheap Chinese goods into the Indian market.
As you can see from what our panel of experts have said, before the 2014 elections, there was a significant public sentiment of dissatisfaction towards the UPA government led by Dr. Manmohan Singh, which had been in power for a decade. The government's handling of terrorist attacks in Mumbai was a prominent concern among the populace. On the international front, aside from a notable civil nuclear deal with the United States, the UPA's foreign policy was often viewed as not being effective or assertive. So, when Narendra Modi came onto the scene in 2014 as a prime ministerial candidate, many saw him as a refreshing change. He won big in 2014 with his energetic campaigning. Since then, Mr. Modi has turned out to be a master politician. He has outmaneuvered the opposition at every possible twist and turn and left them gasping for air. However, there are also some serious criticisms of Mr. Modi's personality and governance. He is seen as the most polarizing and divisive figure in Indian politics. There are also concerns about weakening democratic institutions and targeting opposition leaders. There are also accusations of sidelining minorities and not doing enough to protect them. Despite all this, Mr. Modi's popularity remained strong and he won again in 2019 with even bigger mandate. Now in 2024, he is seeking a third term. To reiterate, the focus of this documentary is to examine the Modi government's foreign policy contributions and India's standing internationally rather than domestic politics. Let us look at some local and international surveys on what Indians think about Mr. Modi's foreign policy and how the world views India's influence. Then we will turn to our panel of experts to get their thoughts on Mr. Modi as a person and as a Prime Minister.
When we trace the global footprints of India since 2014, various surveys indicate a great deal of satisfaction. The 2023 ORF survey shows that 83% of respondents think that India's foreign policy record under Mr. Modi is good or very good. The 2024 India Today Mood of the Nation poll also shows that 70% of the respondents rate the Modi government's foreign policy as good or excellent. The Pew Research Survey on Global Attitudes shows that the world generally sees India and Mr. Modi in a favorable light, with 46% of the respondents expressing a favorable view towards India. This global survey reveals that 68% of respondents believe India's influence in the world has been growing stronger, the highest among all countries surveyed.
Authoritarian, Hindu, popular, clever, effective, disciplinarian.
Very successful, surprisingly so, because he didn't have experience in foreign policy, but he has raised Indian foreign policy to heights which we could not conceive earlier.
Boldness. He is a visionary. He is independent in terms of the policies.
Divisive. This is someone who enjoys incredible amounts of popularity, both in India and outside of India. But he is also one who has inspired quite a few critics, again, inside and outside the country. And I would also, quite frankly, use the term remarkable. This is someone who has really reinvented himself in such a big way, again, over a relatively little amount of time. This is someone who had essentially been a pariah in the eyes of many Western capitals and many Western countries on the whole when he first became prime minister. And yet he managed to get to a point where he became an incredibly active and engaged player overseas, strengthening relations with countries throughout the West and beyond. He was performing at rock concerts in Central Park alongside the likes of Jay-Z and Beyonce. It's remarkable.
Efficient, clever, cunning, and divisive.
Strong leader, Hindu nationalism, divisive, polarizing fear.
Marketing genius, determined, focused, authoritarian in style.
He has provided strong leadership with a single-minded focus on changing India. So if Modi is re-elected, if he can stay in power and ensure economic growth for a long period of time, he may turn out to be India's Deng Xiaoping or Lee Kuan Yew.
I would say experienced, hardworking, and self-made administrator.
He's on the one hand, he's highly charismatic. He's a strong leader. He's a shrewd politician. He's a can-do person. But at the same time, he's also someone who's somewhat controversial and divisive. So I think there are two sides to the story.
Now that we have a sense of people's perception of Mr. Modi as a person and as a Prime Minister, let's dig into his government's diplomatic actions. A country's strength in foreign affairs is reflected by how it stays independent in its decisions. After India gained independence, it was a leader in the non-aligned movement. Later, during the Cold War, India leaned towards the Soviet Union, relying on it for defense. But now, the world has changed. With the Soviet Union gone and China rising, we live in a world with many powerful countries. India is turning more towards the West for security and economic ties. while also staying close to Russia. However, Russia's actions in Ukraine have caused tension between the NATO countries led by the US and Russia, leaving India stuck in between. Today, there are several global conflict hotspots, including the Middle East. So, has India really kept its independence in the midst of several geopolitical tensions? Let's hear from our panel of experts.
If we come to the United States, the only so-called superpower in the world, how do you think the Modi government has managed India's relationship with the United States, particularly in the last 10 years, building on the relationship that Mr. Manmohan Singh had already established with the nuclear deal, etc.?
It has managed the relationship with a great deal of dexterity, with caution, and with balance, I would say. We have to be open to a range of partners, because while the United States is the single most powerful country in the world, we do live in a world that is increasingly multipolar, and we have to then balance our approach to the US with the approaches to the other countries, be it Russia, be it China.
He has deepened the relationship with the United States, signing all the foundational agreements, defense ties or acquisition of defense platforms from the United States has risen to $22 billion. The visit that he made in June last year to United States and the manner in which he was treated by the Biden administration shows how much the United States has begun to value this relationship. Our membership of Quad, our support for the Indo-Pacific concept, the naval exercises, the Malabar exercises, and other exercises that we are doing with the United States has developed certain strategic bonds between us. And finally, the initiative for emerging and critical technologies, which is very, very important for India's modernization and rise, because tomorrow the battle between countries, the competition for power is going to be technology based. And India is determined, and United States is helpful in terms of developing advanced technologies in India.
Modi has attempted to strengthen external relations with a large number of countries. The emphasis of foreign policy is multipolarity. It is not of, just going for the American pole. It is that we must have a large number of multiple poles of power, of which India will in due course become one. Not yet, but India therefore is aiming not just to align with the USA, but to have a separate status of its own international. Within that, the relations with the Quad have notably strengthened.
This year is an important election year, both for the United States as well as India. There is quite a bit of likelihood that Mr. Trump may come back to power. And as everybody knows, he has got his own personality and quite mercurial at that. And that needs, delicate handling. And Mr. Modi was quite adept in doing that during the last presidency of Mr. Trump. So going forward, do you think that bonhomie will continue, or do you see any friction points there?
When Mr. Trump came, he dumped all the initiatives that Mr. Obama had taken, except one, and that was in terms of relations with India. I think as far as India-US relations ties during the period of Mr. Trump, they really saw a very significant move upwards. Secondly, the pushback against Pakistan in terms of against terrorism. Mr. Trump, you would recall, there was a tweet of 1st January 2018, the first tweet of the year that he said, where he mentioned that Pakistan takes us as fools. We have been providing it with more than $33 billion of funding for dealing with terrorism. And it has been making fool of us, and this is not going to happen anymore.
We have a very useful data point, right? I mean, they've had a relationship in the past, and then they had a very good relationship. As I understand it, the chemistry was very good between the two when President Trump visited India, met with Modi. The meetings went very well. The relationship, the U.S.-India relationship, moved very quickly. There were a few issues for sure, but the relationship proceeded quite well when Modi and Trump were in power. I would argue that they share some views. In fact, they share quite a few views on policy issues. And I think that on the big issues that drive the U.S.-India relationship, concerns about China, desire to engage commercially, and so on, I don't think Donald Trump would have any issues with that. And quite frankly, if you look at how U.S. foreign policy evolved when Trump was president previously, there were some major shifts in U.S. foreign policy, but there was strong, sharp consistency and continuity in the U.S. relationship with India. And I think that's in great part because there's multi-partisan support for strong U.S.-India partnership in both countries.
There are millions here who have roots in India. Some of them sit proudly in this chamber. And there is one behind me who,
as you know, developed a very good personal rapport with Trump. The great event that they organized in Gujarat for him, which left him totally, how should I say, overwhelmed by the kind of reception that he got.
Namaste. Namaste. And hello to India. This is such a great honor. Let me begin by expressing my profound gratitude to an exceptional leader, a great champion of India, a man who works night and day for his country, and a man I am proud to call my true friend, Prime Minister Modi.
Of course, Trump, because of his mercurial nature, as you said, in other areas not directly connected with India, might complicate the global situation, which may then have some rebound on India's own interests. And then on the tariff issues, even while we had a very good relation with Trump, he was very critical. So on trade issues, we'll have to be alert and make sure that we don't run into difficulties. But the long and short is that we have bipartisan support.
Despite the highly polarized political environment in the United States, I think there's a high degree of bipartisan consensus in Washington on engaging India. In fact, I would argue that the two countries where there's the highest degree of bipartisan consensus are China as the long-term strategic rival and India as the long-term strategic partner. We've seen that the US-India relationship has continued to deepen both under Democrat and Republican administrations over the last 2 decades, including the first Trump administration. I think there are undoubtedly some concerns given Trump's proclivity to pursue a more unpredictable and transactional foreign policy. And this could manifest in areas of trade and immigration as potential areas of friction. But I think the relationship will continue to deepen irrespective of who wins the US presidential election in November.
Considering the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region, how do you assess India's role and its initiatives in promoting regional security, stability, and economic cooperation, especially through platforms like the Quad?
Right. So, of course, the Quad was not initially an economic mechanism. It wasn't even a defense strategy. It was really to deal with the immediate natural disaster. And the Quad has since then taken on a different role. And the role that it has now is much more focused on reassessing the regional order and to have strengthening of relations between like-minded countries. Many would argue that India is actually the weakest link amongst the four countries, and so that the United States, Australia, and Japan are much more in alignment when it comes to their security and economic interests, and they're prepared also to work more closely together than India. That said, the need to keep India involved are tremendous, and there is great recognition amongst the three other Quad member countries that to not have India in the fold is not an option. And there is this tremendous effort to accommodate a great deal of what India is concerned about, and especially what the Modi government is focused on, and to be able to adapt according to India's current needs.
Now, India has steadfastly stood by Russia despite its escalating tension with the West. Is it India's way of managing the multipolar world? And what are the dangers in managing this kind of a tight rope walk?
I think that's part of the answer. I mean, India's commitment to strategic autonomy and its historical relationship with Russia. I think also relevant are practical considerations, such as India's dependence on Russian military hardware. 60% of its in-service military platforms are of Russian origin. India's dependence on discounted Russian crude, which spiked from about 2% of its oil imports before the war to over or close to 20% after the war began. And I think at the same time, despite statements of support for Russia, the reality is that India has been gradually downgrading its relationship with Russia. We've seen this with Prime Minister Modi not holding a summit meeting with President Putin since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've seen this with India's relatively low-key presidency of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization last year. So I think I would argue that India is trying to manage the decline of its relationship with Moscow as Russia becomes increasingly beholden to China, and India seeks to deepen its relationship with the West.
We walked on that tightrope ever since our independence. I mean, that's what foreign policy is all about. That you engage with different entities, different powers. You don't neglect anyone. You don't neglect your own backyard. I mean, the neighborhood. I mean, also the global south, the country, the large number of countries with whom we have shared interests. So it's really foreign policy management, diplomacy in the word, is all about handling your relationships in a way that is pragmatic, motivated by self-interest, enlightened self-interest, working also as a friend to other countries. Vishwa Mitra is a nice phrase, but without becoming over zealous or over assertive in terms of our own interests.
I think the world will have to do that, because if the West doesn't follow more sensible policies and create a situation where there's a risk of a nuclear conflict, and the Russians have been warning time and again about this. After all, why do countries have nuclear weapons? Why do we have nuclear weapons? If there's an existential threat, then they will be used. So the policy should be to not create an existential threat, which the West is doing. And now even Scholz has said that the British and the American troops are actually involved in operations in Ukraine. And the French president has let it be known that possibly European troops can be put on Ukraine soil. Now, Russia has been saying right along, and that's the genesis of the conflict, that they will not accept Ukraine in NATO. But the West seems to be determined to keep the doors open and, in fact, increase NATO's involvement on the ground, therefore pushing towards a possibility of the use of nuclear weapons, which Russia will not foolishly use unless it feels that really there is an existential threat. Now, the West should take what Putin is saying seriously. So it's not for India to do this tightrope walking. The rest of the world is in danger.
I would also look at another recent example, the Middle East. We have a relatively recent U.S.-led military campaign against Houthi rebels. Not surprisingly, India is not actively participating in that military campaign. But what is India doing? It's serving as a net security provider in another context by using its naval power projection capacities to help protect ships and sea trade in the Red Sea and so on from these Houthi attacks. Again, that's strategic autonomy on display there.
In one of your recent articles, you write that India can be a peacemaker to the world and is well positioned to play a mediating role in various conflicts. Do you see that role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for instance, and Israel-Palestine conflict?
So I think this role for India to be a potential mediator or peacemaker, it's not a new role. I mean, I think it comes through its long-standing commitment to strategic autonomy or multi or omni alignment in its foreign policy, so that which has allowed the government or the country to maintain engagement with all major poles of influence in the international system. Under the Modi government, this has been reframed as the idea of India as a Vishwa Mitra or a friend of the world. However, I think there is a difference between being a friend of the world and helping the world make friends with each other. So I think India is well positioned to play the role of a peacemaker, but there are questions about India's willingness to play such a role. And if I just take the example of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, aside from the much touted statement by Prime Minister Modi that now is not the era of war, India's role has really been quite limited and largely driven by self-interest.
New Delhi, as I understand it, is one of the only governments that has been willing to be a friend of Russia and at the same time publicly call on Russia and on Putin to wind down the war, to de-escalate, to focus on talks to end the war. I can't think of any world leader that could be sitting next to Vladimir Putin and say, we need to end this war.
एक्सेलेंसी मैं जानता हूं कि आज का युग युद्ध का है नहीं और हमने फोन पर भी कई बार आपसे इस विषय में बात की है कि डेमोक्रेसी और डिप्लोमेसी और डायलॉग ये सारी बातें ऐसी हैं कि जो दुनिया को एक स्पर्श करती हैं। आने वाले दिनों में शांति के रास्ते पर हम कैसे बढ़ सके।
China has been acting aggressively in the South China Sea, pushing around countries that also claim parts of the area. It has also been criticized for not respecting the intellectual property rights of others and for being friends with countries that don't follow international rules like Russia, North Korea, and Pakistan. Because of this behavior, the United States and other Western countries are now working closely with India. They see India as a key ally to help balance China's growing influence in both the economy and security matters. For India, China poses a significant security threat, especially after the recent violent clashes at the border. In our next episode on security, we will dive deeper into this topic. But in this segment, we are focusing on whether and to what extent China is responsible for shaking up the international system that is supposed to be based on rules. Let's turn to our panel of experts.
Now, some analysts have suggested that the West is owing India only as a security and economic counterbalance to China. So, do you believe India is being used as a pawn in the strategic rivalry between superpowers?
Well, you know, whether you are used as a pawn or not really depends on your own actions. I mean, India is too much of a country rooted in its own self-interest, rooted in its enlightened self-interest, keeping in mind its global commitments as well. So India is not going to have a unidimensional policy in dealing with China or dealing with the United States or anyone else. Again, in a multipolar world, it is balance, it is engagement, and it is a conscious effort to use our advantages in the best way we can, while realizing that there are limits to what others can do or what we can do. So we have to communicate, engage, and do the best for ourselves.
No, I won't say India is used as a pawn, but the attempts to develop closer relationship with India, as I said, they began much before Prime Minister Modi came to power, because in the West, in the United States, there has been a realization for nearly 2 decades now. In fact, going back to President Obama's time, you might remember President Obama's foreign policy when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State was to pivot to Asia. And a part of the pivot to Asia was to also develop closer relations with India. But I think there is a realization that India is a big country. India now has overtaken China, of course, in terms of population. But India is a country which has one of the biggest militaries, one of the biggest armies in the world. It is a country which has a long border, a 3,500 kilometer long border with China. And it is a country which has an interest in defending its interest vis-a-vis China. And China has emerged as a major foreign policy challenge for the United States and the West in general. So there was a recognition that India was a country which, in fact, India was the only country in Asia which could provide the heft which was needed to counterbalance China.
Yes, I would acknowledge that, yes. I mean, one of the main reasons from a U.S. perspective why the relationship with India has grown and why the U.S. has wanted to grow out the relationship with India is this view that India is Washington's best strategic bet in South Asia to work with the U.S. to counter China for a number of reasons. India's size, its the strength of its economy, its location, and of course its own competition with China. But I would argue that there are many dimensions to U.S.-India relations, and there are a number of tracks in the relationship that are completely unconnected to China and even to great power competition. I mean, if you look at, for instance, educational exchanges, there's been a lot of cooperation in the scope of science and technology. Also trade. I would argue that many components of the trade relationship are not new. I mean, they've been going for quite some years, really picked up in the early 90s after India's liberalization reforms. The trade relationship was picking up well before we were talking about U.S.-China competition. So I think that's an important point to note. Another thing I would say here is it would be, in my view, it would be inaccurate to say that, the U.S. is trying to make India some type of pawn in its great power games and its geopolitical games, just because the U.S. and India see eye to eye on many of these issues, particularly the China issue. India has its own competition with China, and I would argue that India has even more immediate reasons than the U.S. does to be concerned about China because of what's been happening on the border, on the northern border. The Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean region, how it's grown, its military base off Djibouti, the fact that you've had Chinese vessels spotted near the Andaman Sea. This is very concerning for China. For India. So I think that one has to acknowledge that the U.S. and India, at least in the context of great power rivalry with China, they see eye to eye. And so I think it would be misguided to refer to India as some type of pawn.
Sticking to the broader perspectives that you have been talking about, at the moment, both the Biden administration and Europe in general, the European Union, keep Russia as the focus of their attention as the key adversary. And Mr. Jaishankar recently suggested at the Raisina dialogue that it is not Russia but China that the West needs to focus on, because that is the main culprit for disrupting the world order. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. I think India has always maintained that the real adversary for the United States, for Europe, for the world, is the assertiveness and the aggressiveness of China. And we, as I said, over the last few years, that has been increasingly visible in our region particularly, and that is why Mr. Trump moved from the Asia Pacific to the terminology of Indo-Pacific, and from the U.S. Pacific Command to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Basically, because this Indo-Pacific is a seamless geographical territory.
I think there is a great deal of truth in that. In a sense, China almost seems to get a free pass in terms of its own actions. Its actions are not scrutinized as closely as they might be. For example, The Economist has an article in its latest issue about how China carries out surveillance over its own citizens. There are estimated to be about 10.5 million Chinese nationals who live abroad, who are now part of its modern diaspora. We're not talking about the historical diaspora. And China maintains what amount to kind of police stations in 100 locations, keeping an eye on them. Now, is this what a European country or any other country wants to tolerate? We see the huge amount of furor caused over the allegations that originated in Canada and then spread a little bit to the United States about alleged Indian actions. Here is China literally maintaining police stations in foreign countries. How do we give China a free pass?
That is true. China, unlike Russia, has the means to displace the US and to provide an alternative to the US-led order. From China's perspective, there wasn't a rules-based order. It was a hegemony-based order, HBO, not RBO, not rules-based order, and it ended long ago. Like the US, I would say China also supports a rules-based system as long as those rules are made in China, made by China for others. The Chinese believe that who rules makes the rules, and that gives you some idea of China's aversion to the U.S. Attempts to maintain its dominance of the international order. The Chinese believe that the Western hegemony or Western dominance of the international order was an aberration over the last 200 years. The norm was Chinese dominance. The norm, from the Chinese perspective, was Chinese dominance. Western dominance, US hegemony, are an historical aberration. This anomaly must come to an end with China's return, China's emergence as a great power. So, from China's perspective, it was US-led order. It was not a rules-based order. And if you look at China's, record, China behaves more like an empire state, not like a nation state. And for much of its history, up until almost 110 years ago, China was an empire, not a nation state.
Yes, to a degree. I think Russia is a disruptive but declining power, while China, despite the slowdown in its economy in recent years, remains a long-term strategic rival of the United States. So, despite the slowdown in China's overseas investment, China remains a prominent player in large parts of the global South, and it's seeking to offer an alternative worldview through its Belt and Road Initiative and its global development, security, and civilization initiatives. I'm not sure I would go as far as saying that it's trying to destabilize the rules-based global order, but it is definitely trying or seeking to change that order.